What do the Combine from Half-Life 2, the Flood from Halo, and Reapers from Mass Effect have in common? They're scary aliens that conquer galaxies, or they go full scorched earth trying. With the World Shaper Precon, you're now in the same category of villains. Let me explain. The World Shaper Precon, built around hearthhull the worldseed, is an engine deck. Where something like Jetmir is more straightforward, you have a win condition in the command zone, hearthhull is the focal point of this deck. Without it on the board, you'll likely struggle to do much of anything. For that reason, you need to play the psychological game. Make yourself as unassuming as possible, play threats that make hearthhull seem irrelevant, and know that it's very easy to become public enemy number 1 once you start powering up your thrusters. With every precon, I like to establish 3 main goals of my upgrades. In World Shaper, it was pretty obvious what the goals were once I found the 10 cards I swapped into the deck. The first is to get access to more lands. This deck burns through lands as the primary resource. That's kind of a weird playstyle for some, and it never hurts to have excess mana. The second goal is to reduce inefficiencies. The cuts in here are pretty obvious for the most part. Whether it's bad ramp spells, inefficient sack outlets, or just outright selfish creatures that don't do much, we want to streamline the 99 just a little bit. The third is to introduce some win cons. Dirtily decks like this one often dirtle because they struggle to close out games. This reminds me of the Frodo and Sam precon quite a bit. Adding additional and specific win cons helps feel like you aren't trying to bake a cake while everyone else is running a race. The goal is to do all of those things for less than $50. There are 10 new cards in each precon. World Shaper is full of spiny new insects and spatial matter, so let's start by looking at the heart of it all, Hearthhull the Worldseed. Man, does this card do so much. In a deck built around sacrificing lands, it serves as an engine that also pays you off with card draw, my favorite kind of utility on any commander. On top of that, you slap down 3 keywords, an ability that blasts each player for 2, and a 6/7 body for only 4 mana, and this card is a floating synergy station. The secret strat with Hearthhull is to cast it on turn 4 or 5, tapping a creature the turn it comes down to use its first ability. On your next turn, you cast a creature spell, tap both creatures on board for Hearthhull to get to 8 charges, and attack an opponent. Thanks to Vigilance, you can tap it on your second main phase to sacrifice a tapped land, draw 2 cards, and shock each opponent. Szarel Genesis Shepherd is a bit less of an engine and feels more akin to something like the aforementioned Jetmir. You'll want to cast this card when you can chain together multiple sacrifices to pump one of your creatures and do big damage. You'll want to include lots of cards that increase Szarel's power to get more bang out of your sacrifices, and you also want to play big creatures that can capitalize on the power increase. Szarel needs much more setup and help than Hearthhull does, but I do think the Genesis Shepherd is the more lethal option if all things go to plan. That being said, hoping something works isn't a plan, and for that reason I built this deck around Hearthhull. I love a commander that can facilitate its own game plan, and with all the stats Hearthhull has, this is the perfect captain to have at the helm of the ship. Moving on to the new additions in the deck, Horizon Explorer is likely the card I've seen being talked about the most. The first ability is fantastic in a deck full of tapped lands, but it specifically synergizes with its new lander tokens. This ability is a home run in the deck and can easily net you 3 tokens per turn, converting into 3 lands that are all coming in untapped thanks to the first ability. This is an excellent piece that just sits on the board and generates value. Avendo Brushrazor is a bit more active on your board with both card draw and ramp baked in. It's card draw advantage on a red card, so take that with a grain of salt, but having an enabler that can provide value outside of simply being a sack engine is incredibly important when justifying a card keeping its slot in any deck. For 3 mana, I think this is exactly the card you want to have in your opening hand. Now ordinarily, I wouldn't play Eumidian Wastewalker in really any of my decks. It falls into a similar category as Edict effects, and people don't generally love to play against those kinds of decks, myself included. However, I think that's exactly what this precon is. It's mean, and that's okay. It's not particularly easy to get the effect off with an attack trigger on a 4/4 body, so Wastewalker should be a simple case of, if you don't like it, remove it. Where I think this card earns a point in its favor is with Encore. It's pretty cool that you can throw a 4/4 at each opponent and force them to sacrifice 1 card apiece, or you get the chance to draw up to 6 cards. Yes, it's a bit pricey at 8 mana, but I don't think symmetrical removal with damage and card draw should be much cheaper. With so many engines in the deck, we do need a couple payoffs. Scouring Swarm perfectly fits that role. The longer the game goes on, the more value this card can generate. Eventually, you'll be able to make a copy of this card, which can also copy itself, and at that point, you'll have a whole swarm of nightmare fuel flying at each opponent. I will say, eventually tracking all of those copies could become super tedious, so enjoy doing that. In a Agenda Mount deck, you knew there had to be a big creature that was a crazy value piece. Baloth Death Prime is a 4-mana 10/10 that enters with a bunch of stun counters, but also has the way to get around those with a payoff added on top. There's ample ways to sacrifice lands in this deck, so you likely won't need to drop the 4-mana Plastodon here, but having a sack engine that doesn't tap itself in the process is never a bad thing. There's ridiculous value on this beastie, and I can't really see a situation where it won't overperform. Speaking of overperforming, I think Exploration Broodship may be the most pushed card in the deck. Exploration Broodship is basically a Zusa for 1 mana. Yeah, it's a bit more conditional to get there, but come on, this card is so good. Broodship is also a land sacrifice engine, since we needed more of those, but it gives you targeted graveyard recursion with its bottom ability. I think you'll find this card does everything you could possibly ask for and more when it's on your battlefield. Personally, I'm a huge fan of what Wizards did with Spacecraft. I'm a little worried their average performance is a bit too good, but I'll have to test them out a bit more in some drafts to really find out. In a surprising turn of events, Wizard printed land destruction and a Precon and made a new card to do it. A pseudo board wipe with extensive land destruction is a lot of value on planetary annihilation to swing the game in your favor, since this deck is built to sacrifice lands. I said this deck is a bit mean, and annihilating lands is the perfect example of that. I'm a huge lover of utility lands, and Eumidian Hatchery is a ticking time bomb. Unlike the other cards I just talked about, this one actually has a downside with the life loss. This card isn't insane value, there's so much setup involved, and you're telegraphing pretty much the whole time. But even if this only has 1 counter on it, you're getting a token by sacrificing it where you wouldn't otherwise. Now, with the additions I put in the deck, I broke them out by 3 categories. This helped categorize each addition, but it also gives you a near perfect picture of how this deck wants to play out. The first section is ramp. You won't be surprised to see Lotus Cobra on this list, but the justification makes a ton of sense. There are 15 lands that have to enter tapped in this deck, with several ramp sources on top of that also forcing lands to enter tapped. That slows you down a lot. Lotus Cobra also has 2 power, instantly charging Hearthhull to its first stage when the commander enters. I valued 2 power creatures a lot while looking at cards, and I love putting a Planeswalker in my decks if there's a perfect fit. There are so many Nissa cards that could fit in this deck, but I like Nissa Vastwood Seer for a few reasons. First, she grabs a forest when she enters. You can also use her to immediately charge Hearthhull when it enters, and she plays around that curve really well at 3 mana. Once she's flipped, try to +1 Nissa Sage Animist until you get to 7 counters. World Shaper has a handful of Future Sight-like cards, meaning you can often know what that top card is before it's revealed to your opponents. Avoid making a Shava if you can. We're aiming for that ultimate. It serves as a pseudo win con by weaponizing your lands. To help get those 7 lands Nissa Vastwood Seer needs, I like adding Sporocyst to the World Shaper Precon. Not only can it replace itself with Ravenous, Sporocyst also snags as many lands as you can pay for in the process. If you haven't brushed up on the 40k Precons, I'd highly recommend you go back and look at them. There are all kinds of awesome cards in those decks. The next section of the additions is Sacrifice Outlets. Once you've got a bunch of lands on the board, it's time to start sacrificing them. In a land sacrifice deck, Zurin Orb is basically an essential worker. Not only is it a free sacrifice engine, both in its cost and with its activation, it also makes you incredibly hard to kill. Whenever you're playing a deck that combines Jund colors, you will often be public enemy number 1. Zurin Orb helps ensure you don't get caught off guard and sniped before you can do your thing. If you feel a compulsion to live as the arch enemy of your group, toss Rottenmouth Viper in there. It's a nasty little beastie. You could take this deck in a much meaner direction with relative ease, but I settled with Rottenmouth alone for this upgrade. Admittedly, it's a bit of a pet card. While it's not the perfect piece in this deck because you can only sacrifice non-land permanents, there are plenty of small tokens you can sacrifice to this to get it on the board. But you also get a scaling problem on your board. The real benefit Rottenmouth Viper provides is it takes the heat off of Hearthhull. You need that engine to stay safe for this deck to function best. Another way to keep your commander safe is with protection. Sylvan Safekeeper is the perfect option with a targeted shroud and gives you a free sack outlet on top of that. If your big threats do get removed and your options become slim, Deathcloud is a fantastic emergency button. You can be selective to ensure you're doing just enough damage to maximize your output while also keeping Hearthhull on the board for the final portion of Deathcloud's effect. This card can function as a control option, but I really envision it as a premium win con. Hugh the Entwood is in the same boat. There are very few artifacts in this deck, so you can basically write that portion off. You're going to use this card to chop the legs out from under your opponents and end the game. If that somehow fails, Hugh the Entwood can help replenish your board a little bit so you aren't completely screwed. The last section of these upgrades is recursion. At the end of the day, you're going to ramp ramp and sacrifice a ton of lands. Land recursion isn't the primary focus of this deck, so don't overstuff it, but Ramanop Excavator is a budget Crucible of Worlds that can also power Hearthhull on curve as Nissa did. With everything I've mentioned before now in mind, Life from the Loam synergizes really well with Hearthhull if you start to run out of lands in hand. The interaction between these two is super simple and very effective. As I mentioned at the top of this video, there are several cards in here that either don't fit the theme, are inefficient, or are just obsolete. My first cut is probably the most contentious, but I have a pretty good reason for it. But first, I have a disclaimer. I get that Soul Ring is the de facto card of Commander. However, it doesn't do anything special in this deck outside of being Soul Ring. You don't need Artifact Ramp even if this card is the best card in the format, and to be honest, it's just boring. I cut Arcane Signet for the same reason, but to be honest, I'd be more inclined to keep this just for the fixing. And finally, I don't like ramp spells with the same mana cost as my Commander. Skyshroud Claim feels redundant, despite it being a perfectly fine card in here. In the case of Hammer of Perforos, there are better sack outlets available. This felt more like a Commander price inclusion than a perfect fit. And Spawn of Turg falls into a similar category. It's an inefficient sack outlet with a particularly awkward mana cost, and you aren't trying to care about the land count in your graveyard. To that end, Groundskeeper doesn't move any needles for the mana commitment. Worldshaper would prefer to churn through the deck rather than caring about trying to slowly recur stuff. And Loamcrafter Fawn goes in the opposite direction of a bad fit. We certainly aren't trying to discard lands to try and recur non-lands from the graveyard. That's just silly. This deck likes to dirtle, but Multani makes that even worse by bouncing 2 lands. He's too selfish anyway for me to want to include him, but he probably fits better in a landfall-centric deck. Centaur Vinecrasher falls into a similar category, but it's just as selfish and also bad. And finally, I like the idea of Worldbreaker for its removal, but I actually found Wastes to be a negative in this deck because it doesn't provide any fixing. During testing, I actually got mana screwed a couple times just because I pulled Wastes early. This is definitely here for the Eldrazi sub-theme of the set, which is perfectly fine, but also perfectly fine to cut. I swapped in a Forest in place of the Wastes. If you've made it this far, I hope you're enjoying this video. Drop a like and hit that subscribe button while I have you thinking about it. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. For the new players watching this video, I find that outlining a few of my favorite cards in the deck helps establish pillars you can focus on to really understand what the deck wants to do. These aren't necessarily the strongest cards in the deck or the most valuable, but they really fit with the theme and feel good to play out. I really appreciate the self-sufficiency that Dakmor Salvage has, and it inspired my decision to include Life from the Loam in this list. Dredge is incredible for keeping Dakmor Salvage in the mix alongside Hearthhull. It may feel weird to include a land here, but in all of my testing, this card overperformed despite being a tapped land. When you're building a deck around lands, Augur of Autumn and Oracle of Moldiah provide immense utility. Future Sight abilities allow you to move through your deck quickly while also preserving the resources that you have in hand. And while there are lots of ways to sacrifice lands and a decent amount of payoff for doing so in the deck, very little of it actually progresses your game plan closer to victory. Titania and Omnath both create big beaters to throw at your opponent's defenses. It's secondary to the actual game plan of this deck, sacrificing a bunch of lands to combo damage, but killing someone outright with combat damage makes them just as dead. But if we're ever worried about running out of resources, all you have to do is get the Gitrog monster online. Not only would you be effectively drawing 3 cards per land sacked, the Gitrog monster is a sacrifice engine itself with an extra land being playable on top of it all. It's certainly an MVP in this deck. If you somehow manage to bin too many lands and need extra fuel for the land burning engine, Splendid Reclamation is mass recursion for lands in your graveyard. It's not too often you'll need to cast this, but you'll absolutely be thankful you've got it. Every time there's a new Precon, there are cards in the main set that fit alongside it. Worldshaper is a weird one because land sacrifice isn't a super common archetype in the standard set. However, there were some fun options that you can consider if you want to go a more thematic route. What's more thematic than something that eats its way through the galaxy? Famished Worldsire functions very similarly to Hugh the Entwood, but it leaves a monstrous body on the board afterward. There aren't too many big bombs in the deck, so I would happily include this Leviathan. Bioengineered Future is a little more tame, but it's by no means weak. I think Lander tokens are stupidly strong, and you can pump up creatures with its second ability to help station Hearthhull. Icestill Explorer is basically the perfect rare in this deck. It lets you play an additional land each turn, fills your graveyard, and then lets you play lands from your graveyard as well. It only takes 2 landfall triggers for Might Form Harmonizer to turn Hearthhull into a cruise missile filled with commander damage. In a pinch, you could use Might Form to target itself and fully station your commander for 8 as well. And finally, there are 3 new mythic lands in Edge of Eternities you could also consider playing. I don't think you need the card draw Susur Secundi provides, and Evendo's Gaia's Cradle effect doesn't synergize 1-to-1 in here, but Cavaron is the perfect speed in Worldshaper. It's not going to be a standout performer here, but it does synergize with the overall plan. Now remember, this deck needs time to become a supernova and blow up the board. If you're too aggressive early and make enemies, you're going to get blown up like the Death Star, and we all know what happened when they tried building the second one. Take your time, sit back, and wait for the perfect time to strike. When in doubt, Jund him out.